The tale of Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine de Beauharnais is not merely a romance, it is a drama of power, passion, betrayal, and destiny. Their love was as intoxicating as it was destructive, binding them together at the very moment when history was shaping an empire around them. To understand their story, we must step back into the late 18th century, when France was a nation caught in the storms of revolution, and a young Corsican soldier was still struggling to find his place in the world. A nation in flames, a soldier. In the making, the France of the 1790s was not a land of elegance and stability. It was a country drenched in turmoil. The French Revolution had shaken the foundations of monarchy and privilege. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette had been executed. The guillotine stood as a symbol of both justice and terror, and blood flowed through the streets of Paris. Amidst this chaos, one young man was slowly climbing the military ranks: Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, he was a stranger in mainland France. His accent, his sharp temperament, and his relentless ambition marked him as different. Yet it was precisely that ambition that fueled him. By the mid-1790s, Napoleon had distinguished himself with daring victories. His genius on the battlefield was matched only by his hunger for advancement. But for all his brilliance as a general, Napoleon was still a man, lonely, restless, and yearning for recognition not only from his country, but also from someone who would see him not just as a soldier, but as a man worthy of love. And love, in the most unexpected form, was about to arrive. Josephine. The survivor of revolution. Napoleon's youth was shaped by ambition. Josephine de Beauharnais was shaped by survival. Born Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie in Martinique, a Caribbean island, she grew up far from the storms of Paris. Life in the colonies was lush and sun-drenched, but Josephine's family was not wealthy. When she was young, she was sent to France to marry into status and fortune. Her husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais, was a man of influence, but he was also unfaithful and distant. Their marriage was turbulent, though it gave Josephine 2 children, Eugène and Hortense, whom she adored. But France's revolution devoured nobility and privilege alike, and Alexandre was eventually executed by the guillotine during the Reign of Terror. Josephine herself was imprisoned. She spent months in fear, waiting for her name to be called, waiting for her head to fall under the blade. Somehow, she survived. Alexandre was gone, but Josephine was free. And yet freedom came with challenges. She was a widow, a mother, and a woman in a society that offered little stability. What Josephine did have was charm. She had a natural grace, an elegance that could silence a room. Her voice was soft, her manner refined, her beauty subtle yet captivating. In salons and gatherings, she quickly became known not only as a survivor, but as a woman of allure. It was in this world, of political whispers, of courtiers and revolutionaries, that Josephine's path would cross with Napoleon's. The meeting of fire and rosette was 1795. Napoleon was a rising general, celebrated for his defense of the revolution, in Paris. He was invited into the social circles where politicians, generals, and the remnants of nobility mingled. In one of these gatherings he met Josephine. At first glance they could not have been more different. Napoleon was intense, restless, and ambitious, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through any facade. Josephine, 6 years older, carried herself with calm confidence. She had lived through the guillotine's shadow, loved and lost, and emerged with resilience. To Napoleon, she was the embodiment of sophistication, the kind of woman who could elevate him socially as well as personally. 2. Josephine, Napoleon was unexpected. He was not polished, not the refined suitor she might have imagined, but there was something magnetic about him, a fire, a determination that promised greatness. and though he was not yet emperor, Josephine sensed that his destiny was unlike any man she had ever met. Napoleon fell deeply, obsessively in love. He began writing her letters that burned with longing, filled with passionate words that revealed the vulnerability beneath his stern exterior. "Since I left you," he wrote in one famous letter, "I have been constantly depressed. My happiness is to be near you. In your arms, I live over again all the enchantment of love." Josephine, however, was more measured. She was cautious. Still recovering from the scars of her past and hesitant to give her heart too quickly. But Napoleon's persistence, his adoration, and perhaps his promise of protection won her over. Their courtship was brief. In 1796, Napoleon and Josephine married. He was 26, she was 32. He began calling her Josephine instead of Rose, and that became the name history would remember. A marriage of contradictions. Their marriage was a paradox from the start, fiery passion mixed with cold betrayals. Napoleon, deeply in love, threw himself entirely into Josephine's arms. But only days after their wedding, duty called him away. He was appointed to lead the French army in Italy, one of the most critical campaigns of his career. As Napoleon marched with his soldiers, he wrote Josephine incessantly, pouring out his heart in letters filled with longing, jealousy, and desire. His words spoke of sleepless nights, of dreams haunted by her absence. He begged her to join him, to be his source of strength. Josephine, however, remained in Paris. She enjoyed the salons, the company of admirers, and the freedom of her social life. To Napoleon's dismay, rumors began to spread, rumors that Josephine was entertaining other men. While he was fighting battles that would immortalize his name, she was said to be unfaithful. The contradiction defined them. Napoleon, the fiery lover, consumed by Josephine. Josephine, the graceful survivor, torn between affection and independence. Their love was intoxicating, but it was also unstable. Triumph in Italy, turmoil in Paris. The Italian campaign was Napoleon's masterpiece. Against all odds, he led the French army to victory after victory, defeating Austria and reshaping the map of Europe. His soldiers adored him, his enemies feared him, and Paris hailed him as a hero. Yet, even amidst his triumph, Napoleon's heart ached. His letters to Josephine grew desperate, filled with accusations and pleas. "You are wicked, very wicked, my dear Josephine," he once wrote. "You do not right me at all. You love me no longer. All is over. Yes, very soon you will love me. No more." These words reflected a man tormented not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the thought of losing the woman he loved. Josephine, meanwhile, was caught between her affection for Napoleon and her reluctance to be bound completely to him. She did care for him. His devotion touched her, but she also enjoyed the freedoms of her own world. She was not the kind of woman to be easily consumed by another's passion. Return to glory. When Napoleon returned to Paris, he returned as a conqueror. His victories had made him the most celebrated general in France, perhaps the most celebrated man in all of Europe. And yet, for all his triumphs, he was still vulnerable before Josephine. Their reunion was passionate, but uneasy. Napoleon longed for a love as absolute as his devotion, but Josephine gave him something more complex: affection, companionship, but also distance. Their marriage was marked by moments of deep intimacy and long stretches of misunderstanding. Still, they were bound together. Napoleon could not imagine life without her, and Josephine, despite her doubts, recognized that her fate was tied to his. Together, they would rise higher than either of them had ever dreamed. But love alone would not define their story. Power would. And as Napoleon's star rose, so too would the stakes of their marriage. Toward Egypt, toward destiny. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on one of the most ambitious campaigns of his career, the invasion of Egypt. The mission was grand, a blend of military conquest and scientific exploration. While Napoleon sought to strike at British interests, he also carried with him scholars and artists to study the ancient land. Once again, Josephine remained in France. Once again, rumors of infidelity shadowed her. And once again, Napoleon's letters betrayed the torment of a man consumed by love and jealousy. But the Egyptian campaign would change Napoleon in ways deeper than heartbreak. He began to see himself not merely as a general, but as a figure of destiny. The sands of Egypt, the ruins of pharaohs, the mysteries of the Nile, all these fed his vision of greatness. When he returned to France in 1799, he returned not as a soldier alone, but as a man ready to seize power. Within months, he staged the coup of 18, Brumaire, overthrowing the government and establishing himself as first consul of France. Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was the ruler of France, and Josephine was now the consort of the most powerful man in the Republic. A love that shook an empire. Theirs was no ordinary romance. It was a union that intertwined with the destiny of a nation. Napoleon, consumed by passion, elevated Josephine to heights she had never dreamed. Josephine, with her elegance and grace, gave Napoleon the image of refinement he so desperately lacked. Together, they became a symbol of power and allure, but beneath the glitter of their public life, cracks deepened. Napoleon's obsessive love clashed with Josephine's independence. Infidelities, real or imagined, poisoned their bond. And as Napoleon's ambitions soared toward empire, Josephine's role as his companion would face its ultimate test. For if Napoleon wanted to rule, as emperor, the world would demand of him not just power, but a dynasty. And here lay the tragedy of their love. Josephine, the rise of an emperor and empress. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup that ended the unstable Directory government and installed him as first consul of France. What had begun as the ambition of a Corsican outsider was now a destiny, unfolding in full view of the world. France, battered by years of revolution, craved stability, and Napoleon promised to deliver it. At his side stood Josephine, no longer simply a widow or a Parisian socialite, but the consort of the most powerful man in France. She knew the weight of appearances. She knew how to host salons, how to charm, how to make others feel seen and heard. Josephine softened Napoleon's image, presenting him not as a military brute, but as a refined leader who could bring elegance to power. Yet, beneath the surface of their glittering ascent, shadows grew. Their marriage was already riddled with doubt, and the demands of ruling would magnify every fracture. Josephine's secret fear. Josephine adored Napoleon in her way. His passion was overwhelming, sometimes frightening, sometimes intoxicating. But she carried a secret that haunted her inability to bear more children. Her 2 children, Eugène and Hortense, were born during her first marriage. But with Napoleon, she failed to conceive. Whether due to age, health, or fate, her womb remained silent. In the intimacy of their marriage, this absence became a wound. For Napoleon, who dreamed of founding a dynasty, the lack of an heir was a torment. Still, he could not let her go. His heart clung to Josephine with the desperation of a man who feared loneliness more than death. And Josephine, aware of his devotion, fought to maintain her place in his life. But love was no shield against ambition. The coronation of an empire. By 1804, Napoleon's power had grown to such heights that he no longer sought legitimacy from elections or politics. He crowned himself Emperor of the French, elevating France from republic to empire. The grand coronation at Notre Dame Cathedral was a spectacle for the ages. Josephine stood beside him. She had begged to be crowned as well, fearing that without this public recognition, her place at his side would crumble. Napoleon relented, and in front of the Pope himself, he placed the crown upon her head. The moment was dazzling. Napoleon and Josephine, emperor and empress, rulers of the mightiest nation in Europe. For Josephine, it was vindication. From a widow who once faced the guillotine to the most powerful woman in France. But beneath the jeweled crown lay the same fragility. No heir. The empire had grandeur, but its foundation in love was unstable. The web of infidelity. Napoleon's passion for Josephine never waned, but he was not faithful. His long military campaigns kept them apart for months, even years, and in those voids, he sought companionship elsewhere. He took mistresses, some fleeting, some lasting, and fathered illegitimate children. Josephine knew. She was no stranger to betrayal, having herself entertained lovers in the early years of their marriage. Their relationship had become a paradox, fiercely dependent yet repeatedly fractured. They hurt each other, yet they could not fully part. Josephine brought grace to Napoleon's life, while Napoleon brought power and security to Josephine's. They were bound, even when loyalty faltered. Still, whispers of Napoleon's mistresses stung Josephine deeply. She would weep, plead, sometimes rage. Napoleon, though unfaithful, could not bear to see her suffer. His letters to her remained tender, filled with affection, as though his love for her transcended his betrayals. But love alone could not silence the demands of empire. The empire's need for an heir by 1809, the issue could no longer be ignored. Napoleon had conquered much of Europe, but his throne remained vulnerable without a successor. His enemies waited for the day he might fall, and without an heir, the Bonaparte dynasty would collapse with him. The court, the ministers, even his own family whispered what Napoleon refused to say aloud. He must set Josephine aside. It was not a lack of love. It was necessity. Josephine was beloved, elegant, and dignified, but she could not give him a child. France needed an heir. Napoleon struggled with the decision. His heart clung to Josephine, but his destiny demanded otherwise. Josephine, too, knew the truth. She had long feared this moment, and now it arrived with a cruel inevitability. The divorce. Love's cruel sacrifice. On a winter evening in December 1809, Napoleon and Josephine faced each other in the Tuileries Palace. They were surrounded by courtiers, family, and officials. The scene was ceremonial, but the pain was raw. Napoleon declared that for the good of France, for the stability of the empire, he must divorce Josephine. His voice trembled as he spoke, and tears streamed down Josephine's face. She accepted the decision with grace, but her heart was shattered. Later, in private, Josephine collapsed in sobs. Napoleon, too, wept. For all his power, for all his conquests, he could not conquer his own grief. Their marriage had been a storm of passion and betrayal, but it had been love nonetheless. Afterward, Josephine withdrew to her estate at Malmaison, a country retreat filled with gardens and art. She surrounded herself with beauty, living quietly, visited occasionally by friends and her children. Napoleon ensured she remained wealthy and respected, but he himself could not stay away. Even after marrying another, he often visited Josephine, unable to sever the bond that still pulled at him. A new empress, an heir at Lasten. 1810, Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria, a political match designed to strengthen his empire through alliance with one of Europe's oldest dynasties. Unlike Josephine, Marie-Louise was young and healthy, and within a year she gave birth to a son, Napoleon the Malayil, the long-awaited heir. Napoleon rejoiced. His dynasty was secured, but the joy was not without shadow. For though Marie-Louise was dutiful, she did not command his heart as Josephine had. Napoleon remained haunted by the memory of his first love. At Malmaison, Josephine received news of the child's birth. She smiled bravely, but those close to her said she wept in private. Her love for Napoleon had cost her everything, and now another woman held the place she once filled. The fall of the emperor. Napoleon's empire, built on ambition and conquest, stretched across Europe. But it was fragile. His wars exhausted France and his enemies gathered strength. In 1812, his invasion of Russia ended in disaster, with his army decimated by cold, hunger, and battle. The once invincible emperor was suddenly vulnerable. By 1814, a coalition of European powers marched into Paris. Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The emperor who had crowned himself ruler of Europe was now exiled to the island of Elba, and Josephine, she was not forgotten. When foreign dignitaries entered France, many visited her at Malmaison, enchanted by her grace. Even in Napoleon's downfall, Josephine retained the dignity and charm that had once captivated him. But her health was failing. That same year, Josephine fell ill after a walk in her beloved gardens. She never recovered. On May 29, 1814, she died at the age of 50. Her last words reportedly spoke of Napoleon. When the news reached the exiled emperor, he was devastated. "It is true," he said quietly. "I truly loved her. I lost her. She was the one who loved me for myself." Love beyond power Napoleon would rise once more, escaping Elba and returning to France in a dramatic comeback known as the 100 Days. But his second reign ended swiftly at Waterloo, where his armies were finally defeated. Exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, he lived out his final years in isolation. In his solitude, he often spoke of Josephine. Not of battles, not of empires, not even of Marie-Louise, but of the woman who had first captured his heart. "I win battles," he once said, "but Josephine wins hearts." When Napoleon died in 1821, he carried with him memories of glory, of conquest, and of the woman whose love had both sustained and tormented him. Legacy of a forbidden love. The story of Napoleon and Josephine is not simply a love story. It is a tale of contradictions, passion and betrayal, triumph and heartbreak, devotion and necessity. Their marriage shook an empire not because it was perfect, but because it was human. Napoleon, the greatest general of his age, was never stronger than when he was on the battlefield, yet never weaker than when he was in Josephine's arms. Josephine, the survivor of revolution, rose to become an empress, only to sacrifice her crown for the man she loved. Together, they embodied the truth that love, no matter how powerful, cannot always withstand the demands of destiny. And yet, centuries later, their names remain forever entwined: Napoleon and Josephine, lovers who shook an empire.